The board lists a record no living name has ever claimed, and the only man who could explain the initials has been mopping that same range for longer than most of the class has been alive. 39 years, said the first student, a lanky recruit named Preston, tapping the laminated board bolted to the range shed wall. Nobody's touched it, not close. Beside him, a woman named Darcy squinted at the two letters stenciled beneath the score. FD, that's it. No unit, no rank, nothing. You'd think somebody would have asked by now. Preston shrugged. Ask who? It's initials on a board. Could be anybody. Behind them, Instructor Wade Rutherford checked his laminated qualification card against the morning roster, tapping its corner twice against his palm, a habit worn smooth from repetition. He did not look up from the card when he called across the shed toward the firing line, where a stooped figure in gray coveralls was working a push broom down the length of the concrete pad. Dunbar. Clear the line. We've got a class forming up. Floyd Dunbar did not answer right away. He finished the stroke he was on, swept a small drift of spent brass into a dustpan, and only then straightened, one shoulder rising with him while the other stayed where it was, as though it had made its own separate peace with gravity years ago. Yes, sir, he said, and nothing more, and wheeled the broom toward the shed with the unhurried economy of a man who had never once been late for anything in his life and saw no reason to start now. If you've ever watched someone let the credit go to keep the peace, you already know where this one is headed. 12 students filed onto the pad behind Rutherford, checking rifles, murmuring over the wind flag snapping at the far berm. The class was 6 weeks into an advanced qualification course built to test them past 1,000 meters, out where the wind stopped behaving and the math started lying. Today's line ran 1,100 meters even, farthest on the course, and every one of them had heard the number on the board before they'd heard their own service number. 894 out of a possible 900, fired in a single string. No reshoots, 39 years standing. The class's own best qualifying average, pooled and averaged generously, sat 41 points under it. Rutherford meant to close that gap by Friday. He had 4 days, a government contract's worth of ballistic software, and a record he intended quietly to see broken on his own range under his own instruction by someone whose name would actually get written down. He did not look at the janitor again as the old man passed him with the dustpan held level, the way a man carries something he does not want to spill even though it is empty. He did not know yet that the 2 letters on the board and the man walking past him shared an author. He would learn it the way most men in that shed would learn it that week, sideways, and too late to feel clever about any of the jokes he'd already made. Floyd Dunbar checked the range gate twice each evening, though the lock only needed checking once, and he ran his eyes down the flag line a final time before he ever touched the padlock, reading the 2 orange windsocks at the near berm and the single tattered one at 1,100 meters, the way another man might check his own pulse without thinking to call it that. His coveralls carried the base laundry service's patch on the left breast, sleeves rolled twice and no higher, collar buttoned to the top in July heat that had grease-stained boys half his age stripping to undershirts by noon. He never rolled that collar down. Some habits outlive the reasons for them and become simply the shape a man has decided to keep. The shoulder was the thing you noticed if you watched him long enough, though most men on post had stopped watching him at all sometime around his 15th year of sweeping the same concrete. It would not lift past the height of his own chest, not for reaching a shelf, not for anything, and so he had built his whole day around not needing it to. He turned his torso instead of raising his arm, pivoted his hips to bring a hand level with a doorframe, and did it so evenly and so often that it read, to the unpracticed eye, like nothing at all, an old man's economy, a slower gait, nothing worth a second look. Only a very few had ever seen what it cost him to hand something down off a high shelf, and none of them worked on this range. Before he locked the gate each evening, he took the windage card from his breast pocket, brass-cornered, folded soft at the crease from 4 decades of folding, its margins crowded with a private shorthand of dots and slashes that meant nothing to anyone who had not written them. And he checked it once against the flags, the way another man might check a wristwatch he already knew was correct, purely for the pleasure of confirming that the world still agreed with him. Then he folded it back along its old seam and returned it to the pocket over his heart, and only then did he turn the key. His truck sat where it always sat, past the motor pool, under the one water oak the postgrounds crew had never gotten around to cutting. Winifred Dunbar was in the passenger seat with the window down, exactly as she had been most evenings for longer than the record on that board had stood, a thermos resting in her lap, and another waiting on the dash for him. 52 years of marriage had worn the greeting down to almost nothing, which was its own kind of fullness. He opened the door, reached across without being asked, and set his thermos on the dash for her before she'd finished handing him his. It was a small crossing of hands that neither of them narrated. She asked how the flags had lain that day. He told her, mostly true, mostly wind, and she nodded as if he had told her something else entirely, which in a way he had. By Tuesday, the class had decided the janitor was a fixture worth a joke, the way a building's odd door or a chair that always squeaks becomes a fixture worth a joke. Preston watched him bend at the near berm, correcting a windsock that had twisted on its swivel, and called out, loud enough for the whole line to hear, "Careful, Dunbar, don't grade our papers too hard out there." A ripple of laughter went down the pad. Rutherford, tapping his laminated card against his palm, allowed himself half a smile without breaking his brief on come-ups and holds. Floyd straightened the sock, said nothing, and moved to the next one. The second beat came sharper. Rutherford was walking the class through staging for a qualifying string, the kind that got logged and mattered, and he turned to find the old man 20 meters short of the firing point with his broom, working brass left from the morning relay. "Dunbar, I need you clear of this line during a qualifying string, every time." It was not unkind, exactly, but it carried the particular weight of an order given in front of an audience, meant as much for the audience as for the man it was aimed at. Floyd nodded once, the nod of a man who has been told to stand clear of a great many things in his life and has never once argued the point, and withdrew to the shed doorway, where he could still see the flags, and if anyone had thought to ask him, could have told them within a half-minute what the wind was about to do. Nobody asked him. Darcy, loading her magazine, glanced at the board on her way to the line and said to nobody in particular, "FD probably belongs to somebody's grandfather. Man's probably been dead 20 years. Be nice if they at least update the plaque." A couple of students laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a mystery you've already decided isn't worth solving. Sawyer Bledsoe did not laugh. He was 22, 6 weeks into the course, and had drawn range detail duty that put him alongside the janitor most mornings, hauling brass buckets and resetting target frames while Floyd swept and checked flags and said almost nothing that wasn't necessary. Sawyer had noticed, without deciding to notice it, that the old man's eyes moved to the heat shimmer rising off the berm every single time, right before a shooter broke a shot, as though he were reading something written there that nobody had taught the rest of them to see. He filed it away the way you file away a habit in someone you respect, without yet knowing why you respect it, and said nothing, because nobody had asked him either. By Thursday, the 1100-meter line had become the whole course's obsession, and Rutherford, to his credit, walked it like a man who had earned the right to be obsessed with it, too. He set up the call himself, dead calm at the muzzle, a warm crosswind building from the left at the 400 mark, and past that, out past 800, a compound heat mirage boiling the air just enough to bend a bullet's true path if you didn't respect it. He read his laminated chart, thumb tracing a column of holds keyed to his sensor tower's readouts, and called 2 minutes left, a full minute of drop, and told his best shooter to send it. The round missed high and left of center, not badly, but enough. Rutherford frowned at his card as if it had personally disappointed him and pulled the sensor log on his handheld, cross-referencing wind speed against his own call. The numbers agreed with him. The target did not. "Towers say 6 knots steady left to right past 600, he said, mostly to himself, mostly frustrated in the specific way of a man who trusts his instruments and has just watched them be wrong anyway. That should have been a clean call. He looked down the line, half joking, half genuinely out of patience. Anybody got a better read than the towers? He did not expect an answer. Certainly not from the doorway of the shed, where Floyd Dunbar stood with both hands still on the handle of his broom, watching the grass lean at 800 meters in a way that had nothing to do with what the sensor towers, mounted too high and too far apart, could register at all. "Gust is dying behind the swale past 6, Floyd said, plain as reading a grocery list. Half minute less than you called. Hold left edge of the black, not center. Rutherford's genuine skill was the thing that made what happened next possible. He was, in fact, the kind of instructor who would rather be proven wrong in front of his class than protect a bad call in front of them. And it was that same stubborn honesty that made him turn, laminated card still in hand, and say, with an edge of challenge more than mockery now, "Prove it. Same target, same string. Somebody resend with his number instead of mine." Darcy took the rifle on the reload. She dialed Floyd's half-minute correction instead of Rutherford's, settled, and broke the shot clean. It struck dead center, close enough to the black's exact heart that two students actually laughed out loud in the specific, helpless way people laugh when something has just proven a rule wrong in front of them. Rutherford looked at the target through his spotting scope for longer than he needed to. Then he looked at Floyd Dunbar, still holding the broom, and said, "Quieter now. Do that again, with your own rifle." It was not offered as a courtesy. It was offered the way a man tests a thing he does not yet believe. Floyd set the broom against the shed wall. He took the offered rifle, and the class watched him find his position the way they had never watched anyone find a position before, not settling into the prone so much as arranging himself around the one limit his body still enforced, turning his whole upper half rather than raising his left arm past chest height, building a stance out of compensation so practiced it looked for a moment like a kind of grace instead of a workaround. He did not check the mirage again. He had already read it. He worked the bolt once, breathed twice, and sent the round 1,100 meters into a group the class had spent 5 days trying to shrink, and broke it by half an inch. Nobody laughed this time. Preston, who had made the joke about grading papers, stood with his mouth slightly open and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of correction. Rutherford lowered his scope slowly, the laminated card still clipped, forgotten, in his sleeve pocket, and for a moment the only sound on the pad was the wind he had just watched an old man read better than a tower built to do nothing else. It was Darcy who said it, quiet, almost to herself, staring at the board on the shed wall. "FD." Nobody answered her, nobody yet could. The demand, once it started, would not be talked back down. By that evening, half the class had crowded the records office window, asking about 2 letters on a board, and the woman behind the counter, a civilian named Etheridge, who had fielded exactly this question twice before in 11 years and given the same answer both times, gave it again. The original qualifying card had been logged under initials only, a transcription discrepancy from decades back, and the full paper file was sealed, pending transfer under a digitization contract the Post had signed with an outside archive preservation foundation. She could not release it. She was sorry. She had heard the shooting on the range that afternoon and, off the record, hoped somebody figured it out, because she was tired of writing the same non-answer on the same request slip. Sawyer Bledsoe, who believed he was helping, called a cousin 2 offices down in personnel who owed him a favor from basic training and asked, off the record, whether there was any way to just look at the old custodial employment files, cross-reference start dates, narrow down who FD might even be among Post staff. The favor came back within a day, and it came back badly. A flag had been generated for unauthorized access attempt against a sealed personnel record, and the record it had brushed against, entirely by accident, belonged to one Floyd Dunbar, custodial services, 37 years of continuous employment, no prior flags, none, in nearly 4 decades. Sawyer had meant to find an answer. He had instead very nearly cost a quiet old man the quiet he'd spent 37 years building. Rutherford, for his part, did something less careful than Sawyer's mistake and more dangerous. Standing before the visiting honorary marksmanship board that had convened early to review the week's course before Friday's range rededication, he said plainly, in front of men whose good opinion he needed, that he believed the janitor on his range detail was the same FD on the qualification board, and that the record ought to be corrected before the ceremony went forward. He said it with total conviction, and no proof at all beyond a shot he'd watched with his own eyes, and the board's ranking guest, a retired command sergeant major named Marion Lathrop, only nodded slowly and said he would want to see the man in question before anyone signed anything. Marion Lathrop crossed the range shed slowly, 74 years old and moving like a man who had long since stopped needing to hurry anywhere, until he reached the doorway where Floyd Dunbar was resetting a broom against the wall and stopped. He did not say a name at first. He looked, and looked longer than was comfortable for the two board members waiting behind him, and then he began the introduction he had rehearsed for the ceremony. This is the range where 39 years ago an unattributed qualifying score was, and stopped there mid-sentence and could not find his way back into it. He stood with his mouth still shaped around the next word and did not produce it. Instead, he crossed the remaining distance and said only, "Lo, Dunbar," the way a man confirms a fact he has been circling for 30 seconds without letting himself land on it. "Sergeant Major," Floyd said, and that alone straightened something in Lathrop's spine that the years had bent. It was Lathrop who signed the original card. He said so himself, once he'd found his voice again, sitting heavily on the bench inside the shed, while the board members exchanged glances they didn't bother hiding. He had certified Floyd Dunbar's qualifying string himself, in person, 39 years ago, watched him fire it, and signed the range officer's line beneath the score with his own hand, and had simply assumed, for 39 years, in the unthinking way men assume things that are not their direct job to verify, that the name had gone onto the record the same way the score had. He had never once checked. That omission, small and forgivable and utterly ordinary, was the crack the whole thing had been standing in ever since. The sealed file, pulled that same afternoon under Lathrop's rank rather than Sawyer's favor, told the rest of it plainly enough once someone with authority finally asked to see it. A transcription discrepancy, the records office had called it for 11 years running, and it was that, technically, but the man who had made the transcription was Major Elias Merivale, then a training command officer conducting a routine file review, and the discrepancy he'd smoothed over by logging the qualifying card under initials alone had nothing to do with a clerical slip, and everything to do with a scoring irregularity on an adjacent file that made Merivale himself look considerably better on that year's inspection. Floyd Dunbar's name had simply been the collateral cost of a young officer protecting his own record. Nobody had corrected it since because, for 39 years, nobody with the standing to ask had ever asked. And Merivale, retired 6 years now, had not merely let the omission sit. His family's foundation, built around a non-profit archive preservation contract that a great many posts had been glad to sign, had spent those 6 years quietly identifying unattributed ranges and programs across a dozen installations and offering, for a fee, to rename and responsor them. Cutback Ridge next on the list, its rededication ceremony already printed, a paying sponsor's name already cut for the new sign, scheduled for Friday morning. The cover-up he'd authored as a young officer had become, decades later, a line of business. Floyd Dunbar sat in the small office behind the records counter with his coveralls still gray from a full day's dust, his hands folded the way they always folded, as though patience were a posture and not just a virtue. Marion Lathrop sat across from him, and Rutherford stood by the door not quite at attention, waiting to be told what he could do to fix what his own conviction had set in motion. "I could have said something," Floyd said when Lathrop finally asked him why he never had. 39 years is a long time to let a wrong sit. "I came home wanting quiet," he said, and let that stand a moment before he went on, because it was the plainest true thing he had. 22 years of reading wind for men who needed the round to go where I said it would. That's a heavy thing to carry into a house. I didn't want a range with my name on it. I wanted a porch and a wife who didn't have to wonder where I was, and work I could do with my hands that didn't ask anything else of me." He looked at the windage card he'd set on the desk between them, brass corners catching the light. "This range was never mine to claim. I only ever tended it. There's a difference, and it's the whole of it." Rutherford, standing there with the laminated card still clipped uselessly in his sleeve pocket, asked the only question that felt honest to ask. "What can I do?" Floyd considered him the way he considered a gust he hadn't fully read yet. "Stop the Friday ceremony," he said. "Not for me, for what it was going to sell. And put the sergeant major's signature back on the file where it belongs. That's the correction. I don't need my name on a board to know what I did out there." He never asked for the range to carry his name. He only ever asked that the wind be read right. It was Winifred Dunbar, arriving in the truck at her same hour, though it was hours earlier than usual, and she had clearly driven straight from home the moment Floyd called her, who stood in the doorway then, having heard the last of it through the open window. Nobody had told her to come. She had simply known, the way 52 years teaches a woman to know, that this was an evening her husband would need the truck closer than usual. "Floyd Dunbar," Lathrop said again, to the room this time, formally, for the record, the first time in decades anyone on that post had said the full name aloud on the range itself rather than around it. It landed strangely in the small office, the way a bell sounds different the first time it's rung after long silence. Floyd looked toward the doorway, toward his wife, and said nothing at all in response to hearing his own name spoken like that for the first time in longer than he could easily count. Winifred crossed the little office, unscrewed his thermos, and pressed it into his hands without a word, the same gesture she had made at the end of 10,000 ordinary evenings, and it was, of everything said in that room, the truest answer given. The ceremony went forward, 3 weeks later than originally scheduled, and considerably differently than Major Elias Merivale's foundation had drawn it up. The sponsor's contract had been quietly withdrawn the week Lathrop's signature resurfaced, no press release, no confrontation, simply a letter that arrived and was not contested, because a man who has built a business on records nobody checks has very little appetite for a record somebody finally has. The new sign at the range gate was cut in the same plain stencil as every other sign on post, nothing gilded, nothing sponsored, reading simply, Dunbar Range, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the score that had stood for 39 years, now finally standing beside the name that earned it. Rutherford ran the course differently after that. The class watched him fold his laminated chart into a drawer one Tuesday morning, and chalk, instead, a column of dots and slashes onto a board at the front of the shed, Floyd Dunbar's own shorthand, taught to him over 2 long afternoons the old man had spent. Broom leaned against the wall, explaining what 30 years of reading a single stretch of ground had taught him that no tower ever would. Sawyer Bledsoe copied every mark into his own notebook, and never once needed to ask what it meant twice. At dusk, most evenings, if you walked past the firing line late enough, you would find Floyd Dunbar exactly where he had always been, sweeping brass into a dustpan with the same unhurried economy, one shoulder rising with him and one staying where it had long since decided to stay. He checked the wind flags a final time before he touched the lock. He took the windage card from his breast pocket, brass corners worn soft, and folded it back along its old seam without needing to check it against anything, because the world once again had simply agreed with him. Then he walked to the truck under the water oak, where Winifred waited with the thermos in her lap, at the very same hour as always, and handed her his before she'd finished handing him hers. Some names never needed the wall, they just needed somebody once to ask the right question out loud.